Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. How you doing?
Much better now than I was there over a month ago. I think a month ago tomorrow we were supposed to be going to trial.
Chris, how are you doing?
Good, and I love events like this, and so as we go on, questions are encouraged. I think community involvement has helped us get to where we are today with that indictment dismissed, Oak Park, and especially the Wednesday Journal, paying attention to this case, putting pressure out there. I mean, that stuff matters to federal prosecutors, so by you guys engaging in this stuff, it really did help get Brian to where he is today, so thank you.
You should have or can get cards to write down questions as the conversation unfolds. We'll be looking for your questions. Jill will be collecting those at some point. She's walking around with cards. If you already have questions, you can ask her one right now. All right, take us back, if you would, to September 26th, 2025. Brian, what's your recollection of what happened just that day? We'll get into more later, but that day, September 26th.
On September 26th, the first thing I did when I got to the Broadview facility is I wrote down the due process clause of the U.S. Constitution, and I tied it to the gate that had illegally been put up across Beach Street. Because what I was doing there, and what I've been doing throughout this case, is trying to vindicate sort of our substantive rights. I think that one of the things that's been really hard for me through this is a lot of times, sort of we're painted as not being truly patriotic if we're on the left, but I think that our constitutional rights, these are the basis upon what has brought us through 250 years, and we were seeing our due process rights and the due process rights of our neighbors violated day in and day out as people were being kidnapped on the basis of the color of their skin. And so that was the first thing I did that day. And from there, I was looking around as I was standing on Beach Street, and there were drones flying overhead. There were camera towers, multiple camera towers surveilling where peaceful protests had been ongoing. This was my first time out at the Broadview ICE detention facility, and I've gone to plenty of protests in my time. I have never felt so under the microscope of the state as while I was standing there with cameras focused on me from every direction. Multiple helicopters flying overhead most of the morning. So I was on Beach Street for maybe 30, 45 minutes, starting at 6:20, 6:30 in the morning. Then I went over to that intersection of Harvard and 25th, where the events that turned into an indictment occurred, and we were engaged in a Jericho walk. We were walking back and forth across Harvard Street, chanting chants, singing protest songs, literally seconds before the vehicle that Agent A was driving drove through a crowd of protesters. We were singing "We Shall Not Be Moved." It's a protest song that was sung in the civil rights movement, was sung in the labor movement before that, and it's based on a psalm. And that's one of the other themes that I think, I know I'm not sticking to that morning, but one of the other themes is so many of the protesters who were out there with me were faith leaders. And on that day, and on the subsequent Fridays, I went back and I had communion outside the Broadview ICE detention facility. I went back and there was a UU flower service outside the facility. I went to church outside of Broadview more during the month of October than I did at my home church. And so like this was peaceful protest, and then a car drove through a crowd. And then because when a car drives through a crowd, you react by putting your hands on the car. Next, a group of agents in tactical gear marched 500 feet down Harvard, and they shot us with pepper balls and baton rounds, and they tear gassed us. And that is a day that I will never forget. It was the first time in my life I've been tear gassed. It was the first time in my life I've been shot with baton rounds. And it was traumatic. I had a number of phone calls after that where I relayed what happened and was in tears. I couldn't stop crying most of that day. I would get to a place of being okay, and then I would start thinking about what I had just experienced, and I would start crying again. And so many of the people who I know who have been out at Broadview and were out there that day have said that that was one of the most intense days that they experienced at Broadview as well. And it was at a time when our federal government was seeking a reason to send the National Guard. And so I also remember distinctly that afternoon reading a press release about what they said had occurred and how there were 200 violent rioters. And I think they talked about us having fireworks, and I was like, we're in a moment where we can't trust our federal government. It used to be when we taught our kids about who credible sources were, who you could trust. We would say, if the government's saying it, like, it's almost certainly true. And I also remember giving my call to the board at the end of the next board meeting where I talked about this. Like, we now live in a moment where you cannot trust what you hear from your federal government. That is no longer a credible news source, and you have to treat what the federal government says as propaganda. And that is a scary moment for us to be in.
It's the difference between you younger folks and those of us who grew up in the 70s. So that day ended. You went home in tears. Let's jump ahead to October 23rd, the day you're indicted. Did you know that indictment was coming?
No.
So tell us about October 23rd, almost a month later.
So I didn't find out on October 23rd that I was indicted. It was October 27th. It was the following Monday, and I was in my office doing my day job, and I got a call on my cell phone from someone saying, "Hi, I'm an FBI agent. You've been indicted, and we'd like to schedule a time for you to self-surrender so we don't have to issue an arrest warrant and come out and drag you out of your house." And I was a little skeptical and gathered a couple details because I was like, this has to be like, this has to be a scam call. This is like them calling and saying, "Hey, we've been processing your Medicare application and we have some follow-up questions." But no, I checked it out, and they sent me the indictment, and fortunately I had met Chris a few weeks prior through baseball activities, and when your son was there doing a baseball lesson, I was like, I recognize you from all the Miramar stuff, and I've been out at Broadview, and with the way things are going, just like, in case something happens, I want to have your cell phone number, and I want my wife to have your cell phone number. And he was like, sure, I think you're being a little paranoid. And so I call him up on October 27th, and I have to say, "I told you so" doesn't feel nearly as satisfying when the "I told you so" relates to, like, the government is going to inappropriately come after me.
All right, Chris, this is where you enter the story. Tell us about, this is October 27th?
Yeah, I mean, Brian's right, and I was a former federal prosecutor. My partner Damon Sharonis that I have a firm with, we're I like to think very good trial attorneys, and all the judges and federal prosecutors always say, hey, if we ever get in trouble, we're going to hire your firm. You guys are the best. I always laugh because I'm like, you guys never get in trouble. Now that's changing, but it was the same with Brian. It's like, this guy's never going to get in trouble, right? He's an Oak Park trustee. He's a lawyer. He owns a baseball facility, and so it was weird when he called. But honestly, I was very scared because for him, having gone through the Miramar process, and to Brian's point about you could no longer trust the federal government, again, I spent 14 years of my life, in public service working for the federal government, and going through that Miramar Martinez case, and for those who don't know, she was the woman who was shot by ICE 5 times and survived, and just seeing the false narrative that they put out there repeatedly, calling her a domestic terrorist and describing things that I would show the federal prosecutors, here's a video that you don't have that we have that's not true, and they wouldn't change those press releases. I knew that this was going to be a problem because I knew that Brian didn't do anything wrong, but I knew that they were going to push this narrative of these guys are Antifa terrorists and out there, trying to kill ICE agents, and that's sort of, the narrative that they pushed. So for Brian's sake, I was concerned as soon as he called, and we took it seriously, obviously.
Well, as you've established, you both have relatively young children. How did you explain what was going on to them? Brian?
Yeah, so I have a 6-year-old and an 11-year-old, and obviously the conversations you have with each of them are different. I took my 11-year-old for a walk, and we had a conversation about here's what I was doing, here's what's happening, and just helping him understand, like, I didn't do anything wrong, but the next, at some point this is going to become public because at that point the indictment was still sealed, and this is going to change our lives. And my wife had a similar conversation with our 6-year-old, and our 6-year-old's response was, well, Dad was just doing what a normal person will do. And they had just gone through the D97 anti-bullying curriculum, and so that's the reason she used these words. That's you were doing what a normal person would do. You were being an upstander, not a bystander. And both of my kids from the start, we've been talking about standing up for our immigrant neighbors for a long time in our household, because we had the migrant crisis where Governor Greg Abbott bussed thousands of migrants seeking asylum in this country to Chicago, and here in Oak Park we did so much work to support them. So I've had lots of conversations with my kids about supporting our immigrant neighbors, and so they said, you were doing the right thing and you have to fight. Like, there's no question of what the next right thing to do is. You have to fight. And so, I mean, we had those conversations early, and I've had those conversations with my kids throughout, because kids are really good at telling what's right and what's wrong, what's fair. And I highly advise letting your kids be your conscience sometimes, because they're going to hold your feet to the fire and tell you this is what you have to do.
Chris, how about you and your family?
Yeah, and my oldest son, Jacob, who is 11 now, I mean, he knows Brian from baseball, right? So he's seen him around. So, they watched all my sort of national stuff on the Miramar case. They watched a lot of stuff on the Brian's case, and, they followed along. And I think that's important. I mean, again, federal prosecutor for 14 years. Some of my best friends are federal law enforcement. My brother's former FBI agent. Like, I want them to grow up respecting law enforcement, but also at this point, question law enforcement in a healthy way. So I want them to see this, especially, again, Miramar and then Brian's case. It's good for them to see that sometimes the government gets it wrong, and they get it wrong significantly. And I think, and I'm concerned about them. I'm concerned about other kids in Oak Park growing up now. I mean, when I grew up and a police officer went up and down the street, there was a sign of respect for that. And now, people are out there blowing whistles. Like, I don't know what this generation is going to grow up thinking, and that's scary because, again, FBI, ATF, DEA, those guys do good work, right? I mean, I used to do human trafficking, crimes against children. Those federal agents there's some of them that are out there doing good work, and I want my children to respect that. So it's a hard line, but obviously getting to see Brian, know Brian, and watching this case collapse in the way that it did, I think that is going to create healthy skepticism for my children in a good way. I think that'll serve them well.
Brian, as a member of the Oak Park Village Board, how did this affect your responsibilities in serving residents of this village?
I mean, I think it's an extension of my responsibilities, and we talk about serving all of our residents, and I don't just serve homeowners. I serve everyone who lives in Oak Park, who passes through Oak Park, and in 2003 we had 200 asylum seekers who we provided housing for, we provided legal support for, and those are my constituents too. And those are the very people who were being hunted down and rounded up in our streets. And it makes your heart break. And so I was out there standing up with them. I can look around this room and I see other people in this room who I know were out there, who I know were arrested or assaulted by folks outside the ICE detention facility, and many of them community leaders also, in that role. Township Trustee Juan Munoz is here, and he was there the week after me and was pushed down by Greg Bavino and arrested. And actually, one of the things that came out during the grand jury transcripts, one of the reasons I was identified was from a press conference that we did in support of Trustee Munoz when we were talking about our experiences outside that facility. And so this was an extension of that service, but also, yes, I mean, inevitably it's going to color the way we view all the conversations we're having at the board table, and it should. When we're talking about the surveillance state, like it's hard not to picture standing outside the ICE detention facility with towers of cameras and all the stories we've seen about the AI-enabled surveillance that we've seen outside of these facilities, and we know that many of the providers of camera technologies are implementing facial recognition and other things in their software, and so you have to become a little bit more skeptical of anything that's going to be connected in with the federal government right now, because the federal government is seeking to use data to track down our neighbors, and that's a scary thing.
You're both lawyers, as we've established. How did this case affect or change your day-to-day professional activities as attorneys? Chris?
It took over. One of the best things about working with Brian was, a lot of times when we represent lawyers, they actually committed a crime. So having Brian, who so you can't have the conversations that Brian and I had. Like this, I mean, he has great judgment. It was great to have a defendant in a federal case who you didn't have to come in with that skepticism about, okay, did he commit fraud, did he do this, do that? Like he didn't actually do anything. And so to be able to work with him and take his ideas, early on in the detention hearing, like the bond hearing where they were first arrested, there's 6 defendants in this case, 6 different defense counsel. And, nobody was going to obviously move to detain any of these people, but there were going to be conditions, and one of those conditions was taking the passport, which is a standard condition. In the 14 years I practiced, I think every defendant had their passport taken. And when I was going through it with Brian, he's like, Chris, I want you to push back on that. And I said, right, this is standard, like we never push back. And he's like, I want you to push back. He's like, part of why I was out there standing up for these people is because the government was just going up and demanding documents from people. I'm not going anywhere. I want you to push back on this. And that's something that I would never have thought of on my own. But having a client like Brian, who is somebody who is literally out there doing good for others and always thinking about others, as soon as he said it, I was like, that's I love that. And so I said, I'm going to do this. And I talked to the other 5 defense attorneys, and they all said, no, like, we're not going to do that. If you want to do it, go ahead. And so we were last, because Brian's the last one in the indictment, and she set the conditions for everyone else, and all their passports were taken. And then it gets to us, and I say, Judge, we have an objection. And I fought using Brian's arguments about, look, he's out there standing up for the people who can't say no to the government. These are landscapers and other people who, when ICE pulls up and says, let me see your papers, they have to turn them over. Brian didn't, and he had the luxury of being able to push back, and the judge, to her credit, said, I agree with you, I'm not going to take his passport. And like applause broke out and all this other stuff. But then every other defendant said, I want to join in that motion. But again, working with an attorney like Brian, it was to be able to have him as a sounding board and use his ideas like that. It was a great experience.
Brian, how about your day-to-day legal work?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly had an impact on my day job, but I think for me, one of the big things was I've never been in a criminal courtroom before, and it's not an area of law I practice, and so I was coming in with both the mindset of a civil litigator and with the mindset of having done work as an elected official, where I'm thinking some about the public narrative. And so for me, we very well could have lost on the question of our passport being taken. And it would have sucked. I would have had to go get a real ID, which I still should do, but it was important to make the point because these are rights that we take for granted, and it's not going to affect me. Nobody is going to stop me and ask me to prove my citizenship. I'm a white lawyer from Oak Park. It's not going to happen. But it's about the people who can't make the arguments that I could make. And motions to dismiss are pretty much never granted in indicted criminal cases. But it was still important for us to argue a motion to dismiss on First Amendment grounds, because the conspiracy charge against us, and I know we'll get into the legal stuff more later, but the conspiracy charge was based on what the prosecutors deemed a spontaneous and implicit conspiracy. And what that means is, it means that the conspiracy was based on the fact that we were all in the same place and we were all doing the same thing, proximity and parallel action. And that is incredibly offensive to the right of assembly, which is guaranteed to us in the First Amendment. We spend a lot of time talking about the freedom of speech, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about the right of assembly. And so it was really important to me that we outline that this conspiracy charge is a violation of our right of assembly. And then we'll get more to the grand jury transcripts later, but the grand jury is guaranteed to us in the Fifth Amendment. And when we have the violations of the grand jury process that we had in this case, like us getting the transcripts and getting them publicly released, that wasn't a thing we had to keep pushing for. We got the case dismissed, and we could have said, okay, we won, declared victory and gone home. But this whole case has never been about me. It's been about revealing how flawed the process is and revealing the things that other people don't get to reveal. And so we kept pushing, and we got the grand jury transcripts out there, because what we are seeing right now is that Fifth Amendment right that we've taken for granted apparently has been being violated repeatedly over the course of the last year in the Northern District of Illinois. And we wanted to make sure that we got transparency, and we're going to continue pushing for accountability for the people who did that.
You're getting ahead.
Sorry.
March 12th, charges against 2 of the 6, not including Brian, are dropped. What did that tell you about the case against the remaining 4? Chris?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the same thing that happened with Miramar, right? I mean, they offered along the way sort of different exit ramps to us, you know, hey, just admit to this and we'll make this, you know, she won't go to jail. And again, to Miramar's credit, incredibly strong and powerful woman who had the guts to say, no, I'm going to see this through. Same thing here. Like we pushed the government and tried to get them to dismiss. They looked at the evidence and watched the videos again, and then they dismissed those too. I mean, to me, again, as a formal federal prosecutor, watching what Andrew Boutros is doing to that office right now is so concerning and disappointing. And it makes me so sad to see what he's done to the office, because they're not, you know, it used to be a federal case was a lot. You'd win every one. It's not because we were the best trial lawyers, although we were very good. It was because we did all the work up front. You did all the investigation up front. By the time you went to the grand jury, everything was locked down. There's no way out. You had 100%, you know, everything was locked. What they're doing now is just charging and then figuring out later, like dropping defendants halfway through. Like, that is just not the way that the DOJ should be running, because you've already impacted those lives of those people. Kat Sharp was running for office, and she had to drop out because of that. So great that they dropped the charge, but they've already ruined her life. And to run an office that way, and that's the way that the U.S. Attorney is running it right now, is alarming. But to me, it just showed what I already knew from the Miramar case, which is these people are not doing the job the way it's supposed to be done. They're just charging now and hoping that it works out, or people take pleas and those kinds of things. That's just not the way that the Department of Justice should run.
Is this indeed, you mentioned Andrew Boutros, the U.S. Attorney in Chicago. Is this his deal? Is he responsible? Also, we should acknowledge, also in the news lately, it's been Assistant U.S. Attorney Sherry Mecklenburg, who was on this case. What do you have to say about those two and their roles in the direction of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago?
It's hard. Both of those people are friends of mine. I've been out socially with them. I still consider them friends. I think it's tough, right? I think with Mr. Boutros specifically, I think like all other people who get into that Trump orbit, when you get that close to power and you want to stay in power, I think you do things that the Andrew Boutros I knew wouldn't have done, honestly. And I think decisions are being made, this case specifically. I don't think this case, I do not think that Andrew Boutros of 2 years ago, when he was in private practice, if he were made U.S. Attorney for the day, would ever charge the Broadview 6 case the way he was charged. I just don't. I think he was pressured by the administration to make an example of these known Democrats, and he's willing to do it to stay in power. And I think that's unfortunate, because if you go back to like a Pat Fitzgerald, the reason Pat Fitzgerald was so great and is revered is, again, not because he's the best trial attorney, but because he's a guy that he never made a decision about himself. It was always about doing the right thing and keeping the office's integrity intact, so that when these federal prosecutors went before a judge, they were respected and trusted. That's Pat Fitzgerald. He's straight as an arrow. He would never waver. And Andrew and anyone else in this Trump orbit is willing to waver and bend that knee to Trump to stay in power. And that, you can't have that, in my opinion, as the leader of the U.S. Attorney's Office.
All right. The charges against the remaining 4 of the Broadview 6, including you, Brian, were dropped a little more than a month ago. How did that feel?
it was a relief, but it never felt like the end of the line. I mean, we've been from the start, we were fighting for justice. We were fighting to both to prove our innocence, but also to try to seek justice. And so, you know, I had a glass of champagne, and then I said, and now we have to go after them. And that's what we've been doing over the course of the last month, because this was always going to be a high profile case. You know, that was the point. The point was to get people to stop protesting, to try to silence dissent. And so you're going you're going after a high profile case. You're going after lawyers and elected officials. That's going to be the case where you put your best work forward. And so if this kind of conduct was happening in this case, it has me deeply concerned. That would be understatement. That there is worse conduct going on in other cases where they're more confident they can get away with it. And I mean, what you see in this case is a classic example of overcharging with the hope that they're going to be able to get people to plea out to a misdemeanor or take a deferred prosecution agreement where they admit that they did something wrong. It is not supposed to be something the DOJ does. Overcharging is, I believe the Justice Manual says not to do it, but it's very obviously what is happening here and what has been happening in so many of these Operation Midway Blitz cases. But what we showed here and what we've seen in those other cases is when people stand fast and they fight these cases, they win because there is no justice in these cases. So I felt relief, but I also felt I felt an obligation to keep fighting because this case wasn't just funded by me. A lot of the faces I see out here, I also have seen in the courtroom with me at some point. And this community stood beside me and stood behind me during this fight because they knew that I wasn't just fighting to get myself off, but rather to fight for bigger issues. And so that's what we've continued to do.
Chris, what was the turning point in this case? The development or developments that triggered its eventual collapse?
I think once we finally were able to convince the judge to at least not even give us the transcripts, but herself look at them, that was sort of the crack in the dam. And to be clear, like, they were so close to getting away with this. I mean, this did not come to light until the pretrial conference the week before we were supposed to pick a jury. Like, Brian was prepped and ready to testify. We had mock crossed him. Like, we were ready for trial that next week. And, you know, for 7 months we were arguing for those transcripts. And at that last hearing, the judge said, Mr. Parente, one more time, if you want to make an argument. So I made this last one. I said, Judge, we don't even want to see him. Just ask the government to turn over to the court the unredacted grand jury transcripts. That's all. And you look at them. And then if you think we should get them, great. And she finally just, I think probably just to shut us up, relented. And 24 hours later, she enters a minute order saying anybody at the U.S. Attorney's Office involved in the decision to redact these transcripts should be in my courtroom tomorrow, too. And then we knew that it was done.
How did you know to ask about the transcripts from the grand jury session? How did you come to suspect that there was skullduggery afoot?
Yeah, again, this is where it helps having been a former federal prosecutor, right? So one, there were all sorts of rumors about there were issues in this case from the beginning. So that was out there. But two, the way that they operated, right? The way this charge specifically, this 372 conspiracy that they charged Brian and these other 6 with, they were facing a 6-year prison sentence if convicted. In the 150-year history of this bar office here in Chicago, they've never used that statute before, right? So all we were asking for, well, we weren't even really asking for all the transcripts. We were just asking for the transcripts in which this AUSA explained the law to the grand jury, because I felt, knowing how things work at that office and knowing what we were dealing with, that there was going to be a mistake in how they explained the law to the grand jury. Not, again, because I'm a genius, but because I watched the video and I did not understand how even a grand jury would all agree that these guys committed this crime. It didn't make any sense. So we wanted to see how it was explained to them. So that's sort of how it started. And then the way that they turned over redacted transcripts to the court, you never do that. First of all, as a federal prosecutor, you hate redacting anything. It's a pain, right? So, and I know the prosecutors on this case, the lead prosecutor, Bill Hogan, is an old guy. He doesn't come off to me as computer savvy. And so for him to sit down there and have to redact all of these lines, I knew that you wouldn't do that. It's only going to the judge. You never redact stuff going to the judge. So it was that. And then when they dismissed count 1 and issued a carbon copy information, which they didn't have to do, again, knowing that federal prosecutors don't like to do extra work, it's just another red flag. So you put it all together, and there's blood in the water. There's something here, and we all, Brian and I discussed it. And so we knew eventually we would get there, but they almost got away with it. They really did.
Go ahead, Brian.
And I want to focus in a little bit more on the hearing in which they dismissed count 1, the conspiracy charge, because in that hearing, the judge had asked them to bring the unredacted transcripts to the courtroom. And so they had them in a big folder, and the judge said, okay, do you have any objection to giving the transcripts to the defendants? And it was only at that point, without ever providing us any advance notice, that the AUSA said, we think we can moot out that issue because we're going to be moving to dismiss count 1. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, we had a major filing the night before. I think we filed 40 pages of briefing the night before. If you knew that you were dismissing the significant count in the case, they were working on briefing, we were working on briefing, you would have said, hey, by the way, we don't have to do all this briefing on this conspiracy charge because we're going to dismiss that. It's going to go away. Instead, he came holding that in his back pocket in case she was going to ask them to hand over the transcripts to us. And only then did he say, we can moot that out. And so she accepted, okay, well, yeah, if you're getting rid of the felony charge, then there's no longer a legal requirement for an indictment. So I guess I don't need to look at the unredacted transcripts. But that's when I think we really knew that there had to be something real bad in that redacted part, because we'd gone 6 months at that point litigating this felony conspiracy charge, and the only reason that they dismissed it was because they were going to have to hand over those redacted portions, which I don't know, that seems like pretty good evidence that there's something bad there. And so that's why we kept pushing, and Chris did a fantastic job of being such a nuisance that the judge finally said, fine, Mr. Parente, I'll take a look at it.
And just, again, and the reason that I think that misconduct in the grand jury is bad and it shouldn't have happened, but to me, the worst part of this, and the reason that we're still going, is the cover-up. I think these are federal prosecutors. Their job is to do the right thing. Going back to Pat Fitzgerald, you're not supposed to win cases or lose cases. You're supposed to do the right thing, and whatever happens, happens. To sit in those courtrooms while we're making these arguments, and the judge saying, Mr. Parente, there's only 30 lines redacted, what harm could have been done in 30 lines? And you're sitting there knowing that you withheld pages. that for federal prosecutors to engage in that behavior is I've never seen anything like it. That's why it's so concerning, and that's why Brian is continuing to push this case, and hopefully that'll all be exposed eventually.
It was ultimately more than 215 lines.
Wow.
As Bill Dwyer, who's in the room tonight, wrote in this week's Wednesday Journal, defense lawyers are now fully on the offense. So now you've asked the government to cover attorney's fees. What's your argument, and how confident are you that this administration actually will pay up? Who wants this one?
I mean, look, the standard is incredibly high for something like this. You have to show it's a bad faith prosecution. Believe it or not, they have already offered to pay attorney's fees. So again, the scary thing is why they're doing it, right? Because we can only have so much control of this process, and while I trust the court and everyone else, I feel like our team needs to be the one pushing this to get it exposed in the way that we want it exposed. So the motion that we filed is called a Hyde motion, and that allows you to sue the government for bad faith prosecution, which this was, and have a hearing to prove that it was bad faith. The problem is if they agree to pay the fees, then it moots the motion, right? So it's the same thing that they did with trying to hide the grand jury transcript. So they're going to say, hey, here's your check. Now get out of here. You have no more jurisdiction. And then they think that they'll avoid a hearing that way. So it's kind of, it's good that, we'll get the fees back, but it's bad if it ends up taking us out of the case, because then, there's who's driving the bus.
If you get the money back, what happens to the money that you fundraised, some of which I must disclose I was happy to contribute and don't expect a refund for?
Yeah, so the money that I get back, for some of the larger contributions, I'll be making refunds, but I'm intending to donate all of those funds to not-for-profit organizations that are working on the same kinds of issues. ICER, ACLU of Illinois, National Lawyers Guild. So, for Illinois ethics law reasons and Oak Park ethics law reasons, I had to fundraise for this through my Act Blue account, through my my campaign committee, because if you were to give a check to a GoFundMe that came to me, it wouldn't be tracked and reportable, and then if you apply to renovate your bathroom and that in some way comes before the board, it could create a conflict of interest. So I had to fundraise through my campaign committee, and I don't want, at the end of the day, me to have a war chest that was fundraised for legal fees. Everybody who was supporting me because they support our immigrant neighbors, because they support our constitutional rights, and because they believe that protesters should have a right to good legal representation. And so I plan to make sure that all of those dollars go to those causes.
Thank you. Just a reminder, if you have questions, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Jill has cards. Raise your hand if you want a card. We'll get to those soon. As the Trump administration pursues charges against protesters elsewhere in the country, notably and relatively nearby the Twin Cities, do you see parallels to what unfolded here with the Broadview 6? And are you in touch with any of those lawyers in other parts of the country who are involved in similar circumstances?
Yeah, and they've been good sounding boards throughout this. I was in contact with many of them. Joe Thompson, who's the former U.S. attorney in Minnesota, was a friend of mine. He used to be a USA here in Chicago, was the head of the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office until he was thrown out by Trump, and now he is representing like Don Lemon in that case. And so we talked through this stuff, and they tried the same thing. And look, to show you how hard this is, their judge said no to the grand jury transcripts, and they cited Broadview 6 repeatedly to get it, but it's such a high standard that he was not able to get it. So yeah, in that community, obviously, of lawyers, we're always collaborating and trying to help each other. And even since this case, I've been contacted by attorneys across the country about how to do what we did here. So.
I haven't been in touch with lawyers for other folks, but the day after the Spokane Three were convicted, I was on the phone with the father of one of the Spokane Three, talking to him about what he was going through, and I've been on the phone with National Lawyers Guild. I'm going to be participating in a webinar for them to help folks who are going out and protesting and may end up facing charges like this, to think about what defending one of these cases means. Because here's one of the big lessons that I think is really important for all of us to take away from this is this administration is trying to make an example of folks like me. They're trying to scare you so that you won't go out to a No Kings protest, so that you won't go out to the Broadview ICE detention facility, so you won't blow a whistle when ICE agents are on your block. And one of the most important lessons for me from this is when you stand up for your neighbors will stand up for you and with you. So I would ask each of you to continue to be courageous. It's okay to be afraid, but courage isn't a lack of fear. Courage is continuing to stand up in spite of that fear. And if you have the courage to stand up, we will stand with you. So please, Oak Park has done an incredible job of standing up, and did an incredible job of standing up last fall. And ICE is still here. Yes. And ICE is in neighboring communities and here in Oak Park, and we have to stay vigilant, and we have to continue to be courageous. And so that is one of my asks of all of you, and to know that you can look around at the people here in this room. They will stand with you if you find yourself in my shoes.
And can I just jump in on that?
Please.
As an Oak Park resident, I was so proud to see not only how well you guys stood beside Brian, but Don Harmon, right, who is our Senate president. I mean, again, I said this at the fundraiser, for someone of his position, with his clout, to come out to a fundraiser for a guy under indictment by the U.S. Attorney's Office, that is unheard of, right? And he did it because he's an Oak Parker, because he believes in Brian, and he knows that he didn't do anything wrong, as I knew. Vicki Skaman was going to be a character witness. I met with her multiple times to prepare her to testify. Again, that's a political risk for her. Not everybody is on Brian's side. I mean, it's Oak Park, so most people are, but I mean, that takes a lot of guts for somebody in her position to be willing to get out there and put her reputation on the line and walk into a federal courtroom in support of a charged defendant. Dave Hyde, who's over here, if he could stand up. He's an attorney here in Oak Park. He was also going to be, again, you give him a round of applause. But we had prepped him. He was going to be a character witness for Brian as well. And again, it's easy now because the charges are gone. But this was going to be a packed courtroom with a jury. Dave's an attorney in Chicago, and he was going to walk in going against the United States government and saying these nice things about a guy that they're saying is a felon, right? I mean, that takes guts. And coming from Oak Park and having people like Dave and Vicki and Don Harmon be willing to put their reputations on the line for Brian, that does not happen in every community, I can tell you that. And so it made me proud to be from this village.
I have some questions from the audience, in possibly random order. How do federal prosecutors do what they are doing knowing the lies? How do they go home at night? Chris, you have worked in that office.
Like I said, a lot of these people are my friends. And look, to be clear, in my opinion, this is hopefully a very small aberration in the history of that office. And you see it, right? You see these letters from former federal prosecutors signed by over 100 of us, who are willing to put our reputations on the line and go after, Andrew Boutros is a very powerful person and has influence over all of our clients. But we do it because we care. I think 99.9% of that office, the people who go to work there, go there for the right reasons. You don't take that job. Most of those people have left much higher paying jobs. You do it because you want to serve the country in the way that you can. You want to do justice. You want to put away human traffickers and people who are hurting children and drug traffickers and people who are committing the violence that we see in this city. All things that I wish Mr. Boutros would focus on instead of this nonsense. And so they're doing their job the right way. I don't know what happened here. Honestly, I have no idea how those prosecutors could sit in that courtroom and not at least correct the judge after we left and say, hey, judge, just so you know, it's not 30 lines. We withheld pages and we redacted more than that. I don't know how to explain that, but I can tell you that from my experience, the agents that I work with and the federal prosecutors that I went to battle with, they're good people that would never condone this. And look, I've gotten a lot of support from those people, even in the office, who say, thank you guys for doing what you're doing. It hurts all of us, but it needs to be done. So I feel good about that.
I think another thing to remember is in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we've seen, 7 chiefs leave in the last year. We've seen something like a quarter of the office leave. So when you're talking about how do folks do this, there are a lot of folks who have decided, oftentimes without another job in hand, that rather than charging this kind of case, they will leave the office and they will resign. And that's something we're seeing across the country. And I'm incredibly grateful for those people. I also think, though, it's something that we have to be thinking about as we look past this administration, hopefully. We are seeing a hollowing out of so many of our core democratic institutions. The Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, these are really important functions of our federal government. And how do we solve a federal government where so many of the people of conscience have left? And how do we make sure that we get good people back in? I mean, this is like when we're talking about moonshots. I think we're looking at America at 250. I'm concerned about how we've set ourselves up in this moment for the next 250, because we are seeing DOJ as an example, but across a lot of our federal government, a hollowing out of people of good conscience who are career civil servants who have been doing fantastic work. And fortunately, I'm a village trustee. I don't have to solve those problems, but we all have to be really concerned about how those problems will be solved, because that has to be a core issue when we're looking at everything going on at the federal level.
I got a couple of questions along those lines from the audience. How was ICE able to change agent behavior so rapidly? I don't think we had this many reports of bad behavior under Biden or even under Trump 1. Are these the same agents unleashed? Are they all new agents and contractors? Anyone want to offer a theory?
I mean, look, it's hard. So going to the Miramar case, right? I mean, those were Border Patrol agents. The one who shot Miramar, Charles Exum, was patrolling up in Maine, right? Where, he in my opinion, honestly, what happened was he gets to Chicago, is used to being up on these dirt roads in Maine, and he's on Kedzie on a Saturday morning. He literally feels trapped by the traffic and not actual people following him. And that's a problem. And so if you're up there in Maine, and you're used to operating at the border where everybody listens to every word you say. We've all been across the border. It's very controlled. It's very tight. When you come to Chicago and you're not from here and you're in these neighborhoods you don't know and people don't want you here and they're beeping their horns and they're blowing whistles, it's chaotic. And yeah, he's not trained to react to that, and he ends up shooting a Montessori school teacher 5 times because of it. So a lot of it is, not being trained right. But there are also, unfortunately, in law enforcement and in ICE, people who do look forward to driving a car through people, I think, and things like that. And that, that's just part of the system. I will again say, having worked with many ICE agents in the past, there are a lot of good federal agents in all of these agencies.
Brian?
The agent in my case had been an ICE agent for decades. This wasn't someone who got the significant recruitment check, and but I think that right now those folks are hearing from the top a narrative of okay, we're sending you to Chicago, and they're describing Chicago as a war zone, and they're describing what they're going to be seeing as violent protesters and rioters. And if you're told to expect a riot, then you may mistake a peaceful protest for a riot, especially when you drive your car into it. But I think that it's also important to note that this really does come from the top. We have Stephen Miller sitting in the White House, who is giving this rhetoric about brown people in our country and great replacement theory and all of these absolutely terrible things. And so if you take even longtime agents and you feed them this rhetoric and you tell them we're sending you to an incredibly violent place, and that's what you're indoctrinating them with, and then you put Greg Bavino above them, and he's telling you that you're doing a great job after you shoot somebody 5 times. These are the kinds of things that incentivize and reward bad behavior, and then you see more of it. And good people in these jobs are going to leave and be replaced by people who are looking for opportunities to do these kinds of things.
And I'm just to follow up again. I told Brian this. I mean, they truly picked the wrong person when they charged Brian, right? Because to his point, and we know this because we have their text messages. They view Brian and the others as like these radical Antifa people who have chains in their pocket and gasoline everywhere. And it's like when we were prepping Brian and he brought in like what he was wearing. I mean, he literally is wearing like a Village of Trustee Oak Park jacket with his name on it. He's got a hat that literally says "Do Good" in bright white letters, and in his pocket he has a pocket Constitution, right? Like, I mean, you can't ask for a better client than that. And so we were always going to win the trial because, I mean, as soon as the jury got to hear from Brian, see Brian, have Dave and Vicky testify and hear about him, and then I was going to literally put on the "Do Good" hat and his little trustee jacket and closing arguments. It was going to be great, but like. They picked the wrong guy. I mean, that is not somebody who's out there trying to injure an ICE agent. That is somebody out there who believes in the right of assembly and who's writing the due process clause on the fence, right? That's what he is. So they were never able to get to where they needed to go. But to Brian's point, they are indoctrinating the agents that they don't see Brian as we see Brian. They see him as this violent Antifa guy who's trying to kill them. And that's the scary part.
They saw me as trash.
Anybody else?
Antifa means anti-fascist, and I was my mother's in the audience. I was raised to oppose fascism,
and again, nothing against Antifa, but again, the government has sort of bastardized the word, and we filed a motion to keep them from using that word because, again, your common jurors, if they hear that, and these agents would have liked to have used it, they associate violence with it, and so that's where that came from.
Another question. What about changing the rules regarding some sort of judicial oversight of grand jury proceedings? Do we need a change?
I think so. Chris will have to answer for himself, but I mean, I've been reaching out to members of our congressional delegation to talk about this among other issues, because here's the thing. I mean, we almost didn't get these grand jury transcripts. It was 8 days before trial that the judge finally relented and said, "Okay, Mr. Parente, I'll look at them." And so, if our case, with all of this misconduct, they almost were able to sweep it under the rug, I don't know what's happening in these other cases. And so I don't think we should be handing grand jury transcripts to defense attorneys in every case, but I do think that judges should, as a matter of course, have access to grand jury transcripts, because it did not take Judge Perry long to look at them and realize there's some problems here. And so just doing it as a matter of course would not slow the process down substantially. It would allow our system of justice to continue to flow smoothly. What it would do, it would provide some transparency, and transparency would provide a good disincentive to the kind of misconduct that happened here.
Yeah, I think at this point, especially with what's happening in this office right now, we definitely need something, and even, again, just the deterrent value, right? If the AUSA knows that, hey, that someone might look at this, right? Just like the speed limit. If you know there might be someone out there with radar, you're going to slow down. If the AUSA knows for the first time ever that there's going to be checks on the system, then they're going to hopefully act the way they should be acting anyway, but certainly we could avoid some of this.
Assuming we still have history books, what are the odds that the case of the Broadview 6 will wind up in some of them?
I think Midway Blitz will end up as a whole in something, and I think the Broadview 6 is definitely part of that story. So it should be part of it. And again, we have to see how this plays out. We have at least 2 more years of this administration, and every time I think it can't get worse, then I get a call from Brian that he's indicted for conspiracy.
Let the record show that's a joke, right? It is a joke. Last question from the audience. We're well past an hour here. Who is going to play each of you in the movie? Seriously, the question goes on. Has there been interest in a retelling of this case on the screen or other media?
Nobody's reached out to me. Has anybody reached out to you, Chris?
I think we're going to keep going, and I think the most important thing is, one, as we just talked about the grand jury reforms. If it leads to that, I think that's something that can be taken out of this. And 2, if we can get to a hearing and get to cross-examine the AUSAs that we're going to cross-examine Brian, I think that can get us somewhere that will be very beneficial, because I do not think that the decisions that were made here to hide these transcripts were made by the 3 men in the courtroom. I think it went to the front office.
By front office, you mean?
The U.S. Attorney, the first assistant, and the criminal chief.
I have had, I've joked that if this were ever to be made into a movie, I think one of the best framings I could think of would be sort of a redo of 12 Angry Men, focused on the grand jury process here, because if you read these grand jury transcripts, these were men and women from across the Chicago region who took their job as grand jurors really seriously. I mean, there are some funny comments in there, but it takes a real courage to tell an AUSA that you believe their case is a crock of
You can say it, it's been printed.
Actually, yes, this is one of the papers that has printed that. It takes a lot of courage to say that to an AUSA that you believe their case is a crock of shit. And one of the grand jurors said that. These grand jurors pushed back and said, wouldn't the right thing for the agent to do, wouldn't it have been for him to stop the car and not drive the car into people? And I'm like, hey, that's a really good question. The grand jurors pushed back on the idea of this being a conspiracy, saying, do you have any evidence of any agreements? And they were instructed that, they were all in the same place pushing on the car, and so that's enough. And so I think that this is one area where we saw the system work for 2 weeks in a row, because they brought this case to the grand jury on October 9th, and they asked for an indictment, and they got a no bill. They brought the case back on October 16th, and that's when that grand juror said, I saw this case last week, and I thought it was a crock of shit then, and I still think it is. And it was only when they brought it back for a third consecutive week to this same grand jury, and we had the U.S. attorney appear before that grand jury that morning and say, you have a very important job to do, and you cannot bring any of your thoughts about immigration enforcement and about all of these things. The U.S. attorney harangued this grand jury, and to the point that this grand jury, some of those members from the prior week apologized to the AUSA for having opinions, and it was only then that they got this indictment. And so, if this were to be made into a movie, I don't think that, my story should be part of the background story, but I think that one of the groups of heroes here was a grand jury that really was trying to fight back against a completely ridiculous indictment.
Has either of you had any direct contact with any of those grand jurors?
No, and I wouldn't expect to. I don't even know what the rules are on that. But to Brian's point, I mean, but for the misconduct by the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is why this is so heartbreaking as a former USA, the system worked, right? The grand jury said no when they brought that case. And just so people who don't know criminal world, I was an AUSA for 14 years, probably, 100 indictments. Never had a no true bill, but not only have I never had one, but you maybe heard about one a year, out of the entire office. It never happens, and it'd be like in a case with a gun in a car and there's 4 people and no one can figure out anything. It never happens. So what should have happened here, and this is why we know that this was being directed from DC. What should have happened is she went in there, presented the case. The grand jury said you don't even have probable cause, which is more like than not, right? 51%. And she should have went back and said, hey, you could tell Trump and the rest of them we tried, and the grand jury said no, and then they moved on. But instead, they go back and use more misconduct to try to push this thing through 2 separate times. That is the failure of the system. But the grand jury did their job, and that is incredible, because they almost never say no. And the fact that they did their job, and instead of doing the right thing, the U.S. Attorney's Office did the wrong thing, that is what kills me as a former federal prosecutor.
Ryan and Chris, thank you so much for your time. And for your important work on behalf of our constitutional rights. Thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Christiana Akinsami. I'm the office assistant here. And on behalf of everyone in the building, welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association. We're so pleased to be able to support programs like this one tonight, which allow for a place to learn and contemplate today's local issues. Connecting with our community is a natural part of our mission of learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. And now, Dan Haley.
I want to start by thanking Christy and Jean from the 19th. This is a wonderful venue. They are nothing but welcoming, and we really value that. So, thank you. I'm Dan Haley. I am the interim editor of Wednesday Journal, and the three other flags that are part of now Newswell Chicago. The last 4 months or so, we have been a part of this larger organization. This is wonderful. This is good news. There are more resources coming. But I am going to make a quick pitch. We have been for the last 6 years a nonprofit. We remain part of a nonprofit. Our bargain with the folks in Arizona, which is where Newswell oddly is based, is that we're going to continue to raise $500,000 a year in local philanthropy. That's what we've been raising, and we have said to them we will keep doing that. So we need you to consider supporting us. I know many of you in this room are supporters, but if you're not, think about it. The coverage we're doing, we're very proud of, and we want to continue to do it, but we need support to do that. Real quick, I want to make some thank yous. John Roberts over here is filming this event for us. Thank you. Jill Wagner in the back is our community engagement person, and you'll see her tonight. Our reporter tonight is Bill Dwyer. Somewhere around here, Todd Banner is our photographer. And I do want to spend just a minute thanking Brendan Heffernan, late of the Wednesday Journal, previously of, stand up, Brendan. Brendan has done outstanding reporting for Wednesday Journal on Broadview 6, on Village Hall, on West Suburban Hospital. His departure for a new gig in the tech industry is hard for us, but we will soldier on. But we really value, Brendan, what you have done, so thank you. A few weeks ago, we reached out to Brian and Chris and said, would you consider being part of a conversation in the community? And they were, I think, eager to do this, happy to do this, and we appreciate that. Brian is, as you know, an Oak Park Village trustee. He's a lawyer focused on consumer class action, securities litigation. He's been involved in local Democratic politics since he was in college in Michigan, and continues to be involved in local Democratic politics. With his partner, they are raising 2 kids in Oak Park for around a decade, so long while. Chris Parente is a former federal prosecutor working in both the Miami and the Chicago U.S. Attorney's offices for about 14 years. He served as a deputy chief in the Chicago office, focused on human trafficking and crimes against children. He now runs his own law firm and concentrates on white-collar criminal defense and internal investigations. Chris, his wife, and 2 sons have lived in Oak Park for 9 years. So thank you both for being a part of this. Charlie and I have had a chance to talk in advance, and I think I know this is going to be a really fascinating discussion. So, I lost my notes about Charlie Meyerson. I think he sent them to me, but I can't find them. So, let me just say, I've known Charlie for a long time. He has done a number of these interview sessions for us. He's really good at this, and we appreciate him being here. Charlie is a longtime force in Chicago journalism, radio journalism, but I see him more as a really transformational figure in digital journalism at the Trib, and for the last many years as publisher of Chicago Public Square, which is a wonderful morning newsletter. 25 years ago, I hope I bought Charlie lunch, and I hope I paid at New Rebozo, And I said, Charlie, we have this new website. It's pretty good. How in the name of God do I get anyone to come to oakpark.com to read our stuff? And Charlie, like the guy in The Graduate who said the future is plastics, Charlie said the future is email. And even then I thought, really? Email? And damned if he wasn't right. And email, we have 20,000 people signed up for our email newsletters. Charlie is a good friend of Wednesday Journal, and I'm going to turn it over to you guys.